History as it happens, December 28th, 2021. The Future of Work, Part 1.
We're seeing a so-called Great Resignation. Since April, 20 million people...
There's been a tsunami of job resignations in the U.S. workforce recently.
Openings are at a record high, and wages increased again last month as companies tried to attract new employees.
As millions of Americans join the so-called Great Resignation, expectations are changing for pay, benefits, work-life balance, and the relationship between capital and labor. As another pandemic year draws to a close, let's look to the future of work, which might look a lot like the past. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
Robots typically don't come in and take over whole jobs. There is technology, obviously, in Amazon warehouses that are actually putting enormous pressure on humans in the warehouses, making them work faster, making them be more efficient, and efficiency can be good, but it's at a lot of times at the health of the worker.
Well, I hope you're taking some time to rest and regroup this week. I usually take the week between Christmas and New Year's off to recharge before the calendar turns over again. So I hope you're spending these days thinking about something other than work. And on that note, this is the first episode in a two-part series about work, your job, the thing that takes up so much of your time, energy, and mental space. So after listening to this podcast, I want you to go to Google and search for articles about the Great Resignation. Or Google, "The Robots Are Coming." You'll find plenty of reading material. Because the pandemic has been like a tidal wave. After crashing ashore, the water slowly recedes back into the ocean, and as it does so, it reveals all the long-running problems with American capitalism that have been festering just beneath the surface. Stagnant wage growth, the disappearance of unions, the lack of programs such as paid leave that are the norm across the developed world. Here's a typical headline from CNBC. In August, 4.3 million Americans quit their jobs. While some left the workforce entirely, job security and better pay are top concerns for others. Here's another headline. Over the past several months, a rapidly growing number of Americans left their jobs, more than 4.4 million alone in September. But it's driven more by temporary COVID concerns than a general strike, the story concludes. You know, the pandemic has also accelerated changes concerning the nature of work, whether you really need to go to an office anymore, whether the adaptation of automation, robots will pick up speed and replace us humans, conjuring utopian or dystopian visions of the future where Homo sapiens might be able to do something other than work. Let's dive in with Sylvia Allegretto, a labor economist and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. She has spent decades studying these issues: long-term unemployment, family budgets, teacher pay, public employee compensation, low-wage labor markets, inequality, the minimum wage. Sylvia Allegretto, it's a delight to have you here.
Martin, thank you so much for the invite. I'm looking forward to it.
Joining me during the Great Resignation. What do you make of all this focus suddenly on where the workplace and the worker-management relationship is going?
Well, it first of all makes sense. They started screaming worker shortages a few months ago, and it seems like a lot of people have put COVID in the rearview mirror. That's not where we are. So I think everything has to be tempered a bit by the fact that we've gone through over a year and a half now of a pandemic. It was very easy to shut down, right? You just shut down. You put a note on the door that says closed until further notice. So it's very easy to shut down. It was always going to be, even though we don't have a lot of experience in this, of course, it was always going to be much harder to reopen an economy that was shut down to the extent that we were shut down and for the length of time. Having said that, all of the talk about worker shortages seems to miss the fact that we lost over, about 23 million jobs at the low point of job loss. We've regained about 18 million of those. So the vast amount of jobs that we lost have come back, workers have come back, but we're now at the tail end where it's a little bit harder, right? It was kind of like low-hanging fruit at the beginning. And of course, it seems to make a little bit of sense. It might be a little bit tougher at the point we are now. And certainly where you hear the biggest complaints, and that's in the restaurant and the bar industry, leisure and hospitality that has record high quit rates, for instance. Those are some of the lowest paying, low to no job benefit jobs that there are. And so they will be last to be filled, especially when you had, such as last month, over 500,000 jobs come online and that were filled by workers. So there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of shuffling around, and it's just going to take some time to get further improvements.
When we say worker shortage, we don't mean an actual absence of workers. It's workers who are there but haven't wanted to return to their jobs or haven't been able to find the daycare so they can go back to work. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's not one story here. Again, COVID is still an issue for many workers, especially women with younger children, immunocompromised people. And, we've lost almost 1 million people in the country that are now dead due to COVID. I think there's a lot of grieving that's going on that's not really ever being addressed. That means tens of millions of people have lost loved ones. I think it's also been just a jolt. Typically, when you go through something on an individual basis, somebody dies or you've been sick, you kind of reassess where you are in your life. That makes some sense. We're kind of doing this on a massive scale. And I think that's another reason why, well, it's being hard to fill some jobs. We also are having high quit rates. We're having strikes. We're having a lot of union action because people are tired of what they've been dealing with, not just through the pandemic, which has been so terribly hard, but through the last 40 years. For instance, why did corporations and some with government help give people paid time off who typically don't have paid time off? Because we don't have universal paid time off in the country. We're the only country, of our peer countries that doesn't have that. Most have had it for decades. Now they go back to work, maybe to their same job or in the same occupation, in the same industry, and now they don't have that again. And they're saying, wait a minute, it's clear that prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, I need to have some paid time off. So I think that's why we're having this reassessment, rethinking, and maybe a lot of workers aren't willing to take the jobs and the employment that maybe they said was okay before. Now, don't forget, quit rates are really high. If we had private sector unionization above the 6.3%, the dismal 6.3% that we have, we'd have way more union activity right now. And don't forget of the tens of millions of people who are working class poor, that just can't leave their jobs. Most of them don't have unions, and they don't have the wherewithal economically to be able to leave their jobs either. So that we're seeing some activity is not surprising. I just think we could and should be seeing a lot more of it if we had a more balanced economy.
What do you make of the Great Resignation? I sent you an analysis, I believe it was from the Harvard Business School. Contrary to what might be the conventional wisdom about, low-wage, younger people quitting jobs, there are a lot of mid-career professionals walking away from their jobs as well.
Well, that's true. Mid-career professionals who may have a little bit more of economic wherewithal to be able to walk away from their jobs. They might be younger. They might be dual-income families. That certainly is happening. But that's not the lion's share. The lion's share of quits are in the leisure and hospitality industry, and more to the point, in the restaurant and bar industry. And that makes sense to me on a couple different levels. One is, like I mentioned, they are very low pay, some of the lowest paying jobs with low to no benefit jobs, little job security, almost no paid time off or any other type of leave, just in time employment scheduling that makes it very difficult. And by the way, many of these restaurants now, if you look around your own neighborhood, I have here in Oakland, they're on a very limited schedule. They continue to be closed, some of them 2 and 3 days a week. So it's going to be very hard for a worker that even wants to take those jobs that are going to be able to make ends meet. I mean, when they were to full capacity and working full schedules with full expected tips, it was hard to do. It's certainly going to be hard to do if they're not operating up to capacity. So those are where the quit rates are the highest. But like I said, there is a lot of churning going on, and for different reasons. A lot of workers are quitting because there are so many other job opportunities right now. So maybe you're in a restaurant, but you move to another restaurant, or maybe you just move to a whole nother industry and sector because you have such opportunity right now.
How long do you think the big quit is going to last, or is it impossible to know?
Well, again, I don't see it that way. We've had almost 18 million people go back to work. Far more people have worked through the pandemic and have gone back to work than we originally lost when the job trough hit. So we're just working our way through it.
Yeah, I was in New York City recently. I had to go up for one day, and I met my brother for lunch at a restaurant on the Upper West Side, and they had one server basically for the whole restaurant. And the manager said, well, think about who used to be servers, young people who are in New York City pursuing theater, movies, modeling, the arts. So when all that closed down, they all moved home. So those people have yet to return to the city to pursue their careers on stage, what have you. So they're not there to be servers either. When I first contacted you to talk about the future of work, I think you responded, well, what do you mean by that? So let's try to define that, because in the context of the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about we'll see more teleworking, maybe even a 4-day work week. But we can also look at potential fundamental changes in that worker or labor management relationship that are really overdue in our country. As you put it, we have an unbalanced economy. Why don't you pick it up from there?
If you recall, especially following the Great Recession, it was all about the robots are coming, AI is coming. You had folks like Andrew Yang say we were going to lose something like 30% of all jobs within a very relatively short period of time, like 20 or 30 years, which scared a lot of people. It got a massive amount of press. But I have two things to say. One is the robots have been coming for a long, long time. They are not humanoid type robots that take over entire jobs. They help jobs. They help workers that are usually still needed, maybe less of them, but workers are still needed that are being assisted by technology. And that's a good thing in the long run, because even though some workers may get displaced and we should have policies to take care of them, we know, and this surprises a lot of people, that employment growth and technological growth due to advances in robotics and in productivity growth due to technology, they go hand in hand. Since 1938, we've had data on this, and the correlation of productivity growth and employment growth is 0.98. Because a lot of people forget it's net employment. So while you may lose some jobs, and again, you don't lose whole occupations, you may just need fewer workers to make fewer widgets in a certain occupation, right? They become more productive. But then another job is created somewhere else because of the new technology. Productivity is what built the middle class. Because you could make more widgets in a timely manner with less employment, it costs less for labor, you were able to pass those gains. The business took some of those gains and profits and you passed some on to workers. That's what we saw post-World War II. We saw huge productivity gains post-World War II. We saw the broad widening of the broad middle class as there were income gains and compensation gains, again, that went hand in hand with productivity growth. The problem is that now we have what my colleagues came up with decades ago, the productivity wage and compensation gap that started increasing, started moving away from one another, the trends in the late 1970s, and now it has exploded. So what has happened is we're still getting productivity gains, employment is still growing, but workers are no longer gaining their fair share of those gains. The future of work, in my mind, is exactly the same as the past, and it's that too many workers with too little and ever eroding bargaining power.
So the future of work, if it's going to benefit workers, might see a resurgence of private sector unionism. But many of those industries where people used to be unionized have since moved to other countries. Is that right?
Well, certainly, again, because of policy, mostly because of free trade policy, we lost a manufacturing base that we had. We still have manufacturing. We still do make things, but not to the degree we used to. We've shifted more to a service economy. But that was a policy that made that happen. We decided to pursue these free trade policies that kind of threw our manufacturing workforce under the bus. But that doesn't mean that other sectors can't be unionized. All over the world, we have our peer countries that are facing the same globalization, the same pressures, that have higher unionization rates. We could have, for instance, sectorial bargaining. So all restaurant workers, for instance, could be unionized. Instead, we have a situation where we unionize each and every workplace. And that's very inefficient. So I think one of the things that we absolutely need to do, because again, I mean, capitalism is inherently puts power in the hands of the capitalists and the moneyed class. And a healthy economy and democracy absolutely requires policies, laws, and institutions to rebalance power to include workers, families, and the overall needs of society. And so one thing that we should be thinking about doing now is to pass the Protect the Right to Organize, the PRO Act that the Biden administration is putting forth. That would be a very good start, because it's not the case that we have 6.3% private sector union density. And it's not because people don't want unions, especially now. They're pulling very, very high. People that are in unions like their unions. A high percentage of people now would like to be in unions. But it's become impossible over the last 40 years because of anti-union sentiment, because of weak labor departments, because of institutions that have eroded, for workers to join and form unions. And that's their right. And so we should pass the PRO Act to make sure that gets done.
You mentioned new industries, new jobs that could be unionized. I immediately thought of Amazon and their warehouse workforce, which is enormous. Getting back to the robots, if robots alone could man or operate Amazon's warehouses, they would by now, right? I mean, I think
exactly.
They can't get robots to do the jobs that humans do in these warehouses, but Amazon is ferociously opposed to the unionization of its workforce.
That's right. That's what I was talking about a bit earlier, that robots typically don't come in and take over whole jobs. There is technology, obviously, in Amazon warehouses that are actually putting enormous pressure on the humans in the warehouses, making them work faster, making them be more efficient, and efficiency can be good, but it's at a lot of times at the health of the worker. It also has massive amounts of new monitoring techniques that are always looking over the shoulder of workers. That's a good example of what I'm saying. So those workers are way more productive than they were, certainly any type of warehouse workers were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, let alone even Amazon workers 10 years ago. But their pay and their benefits and their compensation has not increased at the same rate. So they actually really need unions in those warehouses. And many times they've tried to form new unions in those warehouses. And this is why we need the PRO Act, because it's become impossible to do so. And that simply shouldn't be the case. All the pressure that Amazon puts on their workers and the mandated meetings that they have to attend, that would all be illegal under the PRO Act. It should be the National Labor Relations Board and the workers who determine if they want to join and form new unions.
To Andrew Yang, I did actually find his op-ed that you referenced before from 2019, so before the pandemic. Yes, robots are stealing your job. Whenever I see things like that, I envision these utopian or dystopian futures. So where is the notion coming from that this next round of new technology, the robots, are going to turn huge numbers of human beings into useless workers?
Well, that's what happened post-Great Recession, that all of a sudden all this new technologies were just going to come over and displace massive amounts of workers. Again, we never see employment declining in this country, except for during recessions. It's never happened. Again, the problem is we don't want to demonize productivity growth. That's a good thing. The problem is that the benefits of that productivity growth are not flowing to the workers. So we've had productivity increase about 3.5 times worker productivity, workers being that much better, 3.5 times since the 70s. And wages and compensation have been fairly flat. And that's, again, because we have this imbalance in the economy. We need the government to step in to make sure we have a fair, more balanced economy as workers become so much more productive. But what does that actually mean on the ground? It means rising inequality. Because if you have an ever-increasing economic pie where workers are much more productive and wealth and income is growing substantially decade after decade after decade, especially over the last 40 years. But for a large amount of the American workforce, not much has happened, not much has improved for them. Where did all the gains go? And what we've had is a huge shifting and a huge redistribution of income and wealth from the broad, middle, and working classes to those who are the richest amongst us. That's what that means on the ground. And so it's not a surprise that you have the wealthiest people in the world and running these corporations and Jeff Bezos and them being anti-union. They just don't want to share their wealth with the rest of us.
What do you think about listening to billionaires' advice? I'm not anti-billionaire. Obviously, what Elon Musk is doing, trying to electrify the fleet of vehicles, is an important goal. He recently got into a Twitter spat, for what that's worth, with Bernie Sanders, sparring over taxes and how much money Musk is now worth at a time where we have gross income inequality plaguing American society. What's your view on the billionaires' view?
Yeah, I think especially recently with these billionaires and their race to space, they can't read the room. And when they run for office, by the way, I don't know why when they're in debates that somebody doesn't ask, just even like Trump, for instance, their objective is to maximize profits when they run these companies. I don't think that they do a lot of negotiation. Some of them don't play well with others. I would love someone to ask them, what now is the objective? What's your objective as a politician versus running a business, being a businessman? Because, it's people now over profits, citizens over shareholders. It's working with the three branches of government and negotiating and getting things done. So it's much more complex in a way. And it's vastly different skills to run the government than it is to run a corporation. And it's always a bit dumbfounding to me how they get away with saying that, hey, I'm a business person, I can run the economy. And there's too little follow-up to that. Am I anti-billionaire? No. We should talk more about the marginal utility of money, right? It's something that I think people should understand, that giving one person another dollar, that's on the margin. That's vastly different if you give a poor person $1 versus if you give Jeff Bezos $1. And that's why we should tax the hell out of billionaires, because they don't really have much use for that extra dollar. They have all the money they could possibly need. When it came to light, for instance, that Amazon was paying nothing in federal taxes, and I do think this is part of what's going on right now with workers.
They're angry about it.
They saw how much his wealth and the Amazon wealth increased over the pandemic and how hard their workers worked. And they took away that, I think it was like a $2 hero pay. They took it away early on. And then they're going back to work and working just as hard, and it hasn't improved very much. And then they see the tax reports that came out, that a lot of these, we used to say at the Economic Policy Institute, where I do some work with those, and I used to work there full time, we just want people to pay their fair share. And then we found out they're not paying anything. And so many of them, with the new reporting that just happened a few months ago, are actually taking from the tax base. We're paying them, these multi-billionaires. The amount of inequality that we have right now, again, it's unstable, because it's not like we have some degree of inequality. It grows each and every year, getting worse and worse and worse over the last 40 years. And right now, there's no end in sight.
I'm wondering if you think there's any possibility that we'll see fundamental changes just in the workplace. 4-day work week, virtual offices. That will have huge implications for the commercial real estate industry, of course. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as we wrap up.
Martin, I'm really glad that you mentioned the 4-day work week. This is something that I've been talking about. It doesn't get a lot of press, and I think it really should. It was about 80 years ago that economists were predicting that in the future, well before the future that we are in right now, that we would be working much less than what they were working 80 years ago because productivity gains would be so high. And while productivity growth is on the wane right now, which is really interesting and surprising to a lot of people, we have had huge productivity increases, especially post-World War II. We absolutely should not be working as much as we are working in the United States of America. And we wouldn't have to if we would have had the increase in income gains that we deserve based on the growing economy, based on ever increasing productivity.
We are seeing a society-wide change, maybe a reckoning or an awareness that something is simply not right with American capitalism. And I think that's because of the pandemic.
That's definitely part of what's going on now. But I would also couch it in what has happened really since the post-Great Recession, post-2008, 2009.
That's right.
I think what we saw Occupy Wall Street. We saw massive women's marches. We saw the Black Lives Matter marches. We saw the student marches against guns. We saw the massive teacher marches and strikes of 2018 and 2019. So I do believe that couched in the more recent history that has happened in all of the marches and the massive actions that we have seen, that this is just building more on all of that. Things don't turn on a dime. But I think that you're right, that people are fed up. We are saying enough is enough, and we have to do things differently. But we won't unless we make our government officials do so. And that is becoming harder and harder and harder because there's far too little daylight between the capitalism and government and the wealthy elites. We're in this vicious cycle of wealthy elites, corporations that beget the policies that they need, that beget them ever more wealth. And that's been going on now for 40 years. But I think another thing that you're kind of getting at is that this idea that government is part of the problem. We've been shown now the reaction of our government, the responsiveness of relief from our government over COVID showed the American people what government can and should be doing.
Polls show, more so among Democrats than Republicans, but polls do show that policies like paid family leave, higher taxes on the wealthy, policies, generally speaking, to ameliorate poverty are popular. People get the sense that the government needs to do this, but with a 50-50 Senate, change is next to impossible.
Right, Martin.
Not to get into politics, but we'll get into politics.
Yeah, but I do think it's a very important point because I said earlier that you have to rebalance the economy to have a healthy economy and democracy. And what you've just said, which is so true, a bunch of policy ideas that we have, universal health care, universal pre-K, higher minimum wages, higher taxes on the wealthy, the idea, what we're hearing a lot about now, to negotiate drug prices, are vastly important to the American people, even Republicans. So we have majorities, and sometimes huge majorities, that agree in this country on certain policies, but it doesn't get done. And that's pointing to the inherent imbalance, and that imbalance breaking down not only economics and fairness to workers and families in the economy, but also our democracy.
Well, it has been said that one cannot have full civil rights or human rights without economic rights. Sylvia Allegretto of the University of California, Berkeley, we thank you for giving us a lot to think about. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it's part 2 of The Future of Work. We're going to speak to a futurist, not a fortune teller or a time traveler, a futurist, as we wrap up our very first year reporting History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.